And that reminds me of when at Christmas time, you go on Christmas Eve to the mall, and there are a lot of people. You can't do anything without bumping into people. But it's not really a community, because it's just kind of a pile of people. It's just everybody who happened to be in one place together. There's something special that makes a community, and I think weaving is a really interesting way to think about that. I'm biased because I am a weaver, but the weaver picks the yarns. So if I'm going to make something, I get to decide, do I use purple? Do I use purple next to red? Do I use purple and green and orange together? What do I want? As the weaver, I make the decision on the yarns, and then I cut the yarns and I line them up, and I get to decide how they're lined up. The yarn does not get to decide that, although I may look at the yarn and say, well, these two colors do not look good together, and these do go well together. But still, in the end, it's the weaver who arranges the pieces of yarn. And when the weaving is done, I get different kinds of cloth. There was the shawl, which is lovely when it's chilly outside. There are towels, which are lovely if you spill something or make a mess. There are some things that are just about creating a lovely space and hospitality, and those would be the wall hangings. And once the weaving is done and taken off the loom, there's one more step that turns it from a crowd of yarn into a piece of cloth, a community of yarn, so to speak. And that is wet finishing. And in wet finishing, the yarns, which as soon as I take them off the loom, they'll just fall apart. They'll come apart very easily. But once I wet finish it, which is putting it in the washing machine on the heaviest wash cycle with the hottest water that the yarn can stand, and it scours it, and all of the yarn just kind of adjusts to all of the other yarn. And then when I take it out of the washer and I put it through the hottest, hardest dryer cycle I can that the yarn can handle, so wool, for example, doesn't get dried quite as hard as cotton would, then I can cut that cloth and I can turn it into several different pieces, and it won't unravel because it has become cloth, not just a web of yarns. It has become a community of yarn. And if we take that idea to a church community, God gathers us. God brings us together with whatever we have, whatever our colors and textures and lengths and whoever we are. And then God prunes us in the process of community. So you may sometimes feel like, oh, well, I used to do this and now I can't do that anymore. And that may just be a part of God pruning you. Or maybe you're affected by the people in your community, by the people that are around you. We are brought into specific communities because we have specific gifts and talents. And yarn, or as people who come to community, we all have our own reasons, but they are our reasons why we're here. So just like each piece of yarn is put in order by God, so God brings us together and doesn't necessarily want us making decisions about each other. God brings us. And if we feel we're here, then we're here. Now, different communities, when they're brought together, they have different skills and interests. And they follow Jesus in different ways. So some communities reach out to refugees, like Jesus spoke to the Samaritan woman at the well. Some communities are really good at supporting people who are in crisis or who are grieving, like Jesus did when he wept because his good friend Mary was sad that her brother Lazarus had died. Some communities are great at creating disciples who then go out and create new programs and new communities, just like Jesus did when he sent out the disciples. Now, Jesus could do all of the things, but we can't because we are not Jesus. Instead, we come together in communities, and our communities have specialties. But if you look at all the communities, and not just all the Lutheran communities, all the communities that proclaim Christ, we find that we're doing a lot of the work, the same kinds of things that Jesus did. And then we get to wet finishing. And wet finishing in a church can be rough. It might include the vigorous washing of debate. It might include the scouring of disagreement. It might include challenging one another and finding ways that we have to fit together. But if a community, once it has gone through those conflicts, and it might be something tiny or it might be something big, but as we go through the conflicts and resolve them in love, the way Jesus taught us to love, the community gets stronger and stronger. The community can also include the tiniest baby and the oldest matriarch. And here again, the yarn and the weaving analogy is good because every yarn is held up by every other piece of yarn. In a weaving, every up and down piece of yarn touches every back and forth piece of yarn. And if one piece of yarn gets a little frayed, the others hold it together. Or I can have some really delicate yarn and I surround it with something strong like cotton, and the whole piece of yarn is more beautiful and it holds together better. And we get this idea of every piece of yarn, every person has their own purpose, job, opportunity. And when I think of it that way, the idea of hypocrite just doesn't make sense to me. And so at the Zoom on Wednesday night, I asked the people who were there, what do you think hypocrites are? Because that's the way to do it, right? I don't know the answers, so I'll ask other people and they'll tell me things. And they said, a hypocrite was someone who thought they were better than the others because they went to church. And then in going deeper this morning, someone said, well, a hypocrite is somebody who does one thing but says a different thing. And all of those things are true. But if we're looking at a community of people, we have room to make mistakes because we hold each other up. Furthermore, if you're going to blame the church for hypocrisy, well, there are some hypocrites outside of church too. And there is no shortage of them. Just watch the news or look at Facebook for 5 minutes. And you will find out there are all kinds of people who are saying things that they don't act on. But if you think of a church as living out in community and doing the things that Jesus taught, then each individual person doesn't have a choice but act as moving toward Jesus. The cloth as a whole, the congregation as a whole is what becomes important. And as people come to visit, they can be overwhelmed by the sense that this community is there. And so do we all make mistakes? Yes, we make mistakes in church and we make mistakes out of church. But when we come together as a community, our mistakes can balance each other out. And we can show people love, and we can wrap around people like we're a shawl, or we can help people clean up their lives like we're a towel. And then the final part. What about the bossy people who say and do exactly the same thing? Well, I don't like it when people think of me as bossy, even if I am. I like for people to think of me as a leader. Because leaders are special. Leaders are set apart. Leaders have special skills and talents. Leaders get to tell everybody, bossy people tell everybody what to do, but leaders, we get confused on that sometimes. When does leadership, where we are showing, become bossiness where we are telling? Well, that's a good question. But what I want to point out here is at church, we're all baptized. Newcomers are welcomed into community and offered baptism. And baptism with the water is the start of our wet finishing, in which we all learn to walk together and become one. In the baptism service, we promise as a community especially with babies, we say, I believe, because the community is saying, little baby, you're part of us now. And we believe, and so you will believe. You are part of our community, part of our cloth. Everybody is special. Everybody is set apart. Everybody has special skills and talents. And because everybody is special and set apart, we're free to work together. We don't have to lord anything over anybody else. We don't have to worry. We can just say, we are all one. We bring different things. Now, Jesus was the most special person who ever lived. I say that with complete and utter confidence. There's never been a Jesus before. There's never going to be a Jesus again. Jesus was totally unique. Jesus could have been the bossiest ever. But do you know what Jesus did? You all know what Jesus did. Jesus ate with the crooks and traitors of the day, the tax collectors, who had to collect a certain amount of money, but as long as they collected it, they could do anything they wanted. So they just upped the bills a little and skimmed off the top, taking money from their neighbors and fellow community members. Jesus had dinner with them all the time. Jesus hung around with a Samaritan woman. A woman of all things. Can you imagine? That woman then became the first missionary. The Samaritan woman at the well ran off and told her friends and said, come and see this Jesus. In fact, Jesus valued women in general. So even when the women were caught in adultery, he didn't just blame the woman. He said, well, there were men involved too. And Jesus held them all accountable and forgave everyone. Jesus, in fact, loved everyone so much and reserved his harshest criticisms for the people who called themselves leaders. So being a leader must mean something different to Jesus. And if we say even the tiniest baby, as a member of the cloth of the community of St. Philip Lutheran Church or Parkwood United Methodist Church or St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, how can a baby be a leader? What on earth? Well, what if you look at your baby, and we all have our babies. Think of your baby now. And then you see a baby who doesn't have all the love and cute clothes and good food that your baby has. Maybe your heart goes out to that other baby and it moves you to behave like Jesus would behave, which is, how can I help these other babies who don't have what my baby has? And that then means that your baby was a leader because it led you to act more like Jesus. The same with teenagers. What can a teenager do? Well, teenagers hang out with each other, and it might be as simple as saying, nah, man, I don't want to do that, whatever that is, whether it's destroying something or smoking something, but just nah, I don't roll that way, is a form of leadership, leading friends back to the way of Jesus. And I could go on, but we are all leaders in some way, and church is where we learn the leadership. Because leadership is really following Jesus. Church is where we realize that being leaders is not just being in front of others, it's walking alongside others, inviting them to join us on the path that Jesus had walked. Church is where we learn and are strengthened in our ability to be, in the words of Pastor Chad 2 weeks ago, co-creators of God, making created spaces of love instead of uncreators, where there's harsh language, unloving response. Church is where, unlike most social or civic groups, every single one of you is a leader of some kind because we are leading in the pursuit of Jesus. So, ways you might be a leader at St. Philip: make and deliver sack lunches. Build a new home for someone who doesn't have a lot of money to pay for a fancy house. Set up communion so the worship services can happen. Sing in a choir or play an instrument or just sing loud in worship so the people around you are motivated to sing loud too, and we have an incense of praise going up to God. You could attend mission tables and think creatively and draw on your experience in whatever you do on how the church can better lead people to Jesus. And that's, I think, why it's good to be a member of a church, because God loves you. Because church communities are places to experience that love, to learn about it, and to find ways to share it, both within the community and outside the community in your everyday life. Because in following Jesus, the church has a reason to exist that goes so far beyond who we are as broken, struggling creatures, just as a piece of cloth is so far beyond what those individual pieces of thread are. Because coming together as a community, in the particular community that is church, we have a reason and the means to be co-creators with God. So go make some sandwiches, help build houses, bring your unneeded household items to find new homes where they're needed. Join the altar guild or become a greeter, serve on a committee, or participate in a praise band or a choir or do a solo. Find your spot. Be the thread that you were created to be in the cloth of this church community that is St. Philip, as part of the larger cloth of all of Christendom. Then love and serve and lead joyfully, knowing that God has placed you and everyone around you exactly where you should be. Amen.